Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is William Wolf. I'm your host today. It's March 3, 2024. Have a great show for you today, as usual. Today is a special show with Devin Spears, my guest. He's been my guest before. Devin, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm great, Bill. How are you?
Well, I'm very, very pleased to have you here. Let me give you a brief introduction here. Devin Spear was born and raised in New York. He lived in Israel for 10 years. He has a degree in Jewish history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and served in the Israeli Defense Forces. Mr. Spear has spoken to numerous live radio and television audiences in defense of Israel. Devin Spear is the author of a blog on the Times of Israel and of the book The Future of Israel, winner of the 2005 Gallup Award. He currently divides his time between Scottsdale, Arizona, and Netanya, Israel. You can view all of his articles, interviews, and debates at www.devinspear.com. That's DEVINSPER.com. Thank you for being here again, Devin. We've got so much to talk about. It's really a tragedy what's going on in Israel right now with Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said repeatedly that Israel will not stop short of total victory in her current war in Gaza. So the question is, what constitutes victory, and I mean total victory, in this war?
First of all, let's talk about what's not victory in this war. The enemy does not care about human life. They hide in hospitals, as we know. Their headquarters are under schools and hospitals and civilian infrastructure. So they care nothing, not only about, of course, Israeli lives, but about Palestinian lives. And they are keeping food from the people in Gaza because it will create pressure on Israel. So human life is not the issue, and the number of Hamas people who have been killed by Israel, which is about 13,000 so far, they don't care about that. They'll replace that. And property is not of interest to them. So there have been this is the fifth war in Gaza for the last 16 years. So we've averaged about a war every 3 years. And each time they were able to rebuild because money from Qatar and other countries, Iran, flowed in and they rebuilt. So they don't care about the destruction either. What they do care about is territory. When Israel defeated the Arabs in 1948, they called that the Nakba, the disaster, because Israel gained territory and gained a state. In 1967, likewise, Israel gained territory, and that was universally acknowledged as the defeat by her enemies. So the only thing that they are going to see as defeat and that we can call a victory is if Israel will take, not give territory. Now, from the beginning of the conflict until today, the Palestinians have not agreed to give 1 inch of territory. From all the negotiations we've had going back to the Oslo Accords, they have not compromised on 1 inch. I'll quote the Palestinian Charter: Palestine is one indivisible from the river to the sea. It says fixed and non-negotiable. Israel, on the other hand, has continually compromised on her territory in every agreement, and this has been completely ineffective.
Well, you take a sausage and you keep slicing it. Eventually, you don't have a sausage anymore. As most people know, Israel is very small. Internationally, you might realize it's about the size of the U.S. state of New Jersey. Locally here in Arizona, it's about the size of this county. There's 15 counties in Arizona, and this is about the size of Maricopa County, where Phoenix is located. Aside from Hamas, don't countries generally view their national territory as sacrosanct and the control of territory as the key to victory in war? And it does not seem to apply to Israel, because Israel has not been gaining any territory. It's been making concessions.
Yes, exactly. Israel is the only example that I know of in all of human history where the victor is ceding territory to the vanquished, and especially where the victor has been attacked by an aggressor and then is ceding territory to that aggressor after the aggressor is defeated. And from the first separation of forces agreement in Egypt in 1974 until today, Israel has just made one territorial concession after another, even though she's won each of these wars, whereas her enemies have refused to make any territorial compromise on principle.
Okay, can you give an example of how territorial concessions have hurt Israel? I think we all know the answer to that, but can you spell it out for us?
Yeah, but I'd like to give you a specific examples that will make it very clear. Israel gave back Gaza and the West Bank, gave it to
Judea and Samaria.
Judea and Samaria to the Palestinian Authority, and Gaza to Hamas, and we all know what the result of that was. But I want to give you another older example. In 1979, under the Separation of Forces Agreement with Egypt, Israel agreed to give the town of Yamit over to Egypt. It had built Yamit as a buffer between Sinai and Egypt.
Israel had built
Israel had built this town with 2,000 residents and plans for 200,000. And it had built it so that never again would Egypt have access to Gaza, or never again could Israel be attacked from Gaza. Now, under this agreement, because the Egyptians didn't agree to compromise on 1 inch of land, the Israelis gave back every inch of Sinai, including Yamit, and they dismantled the town. Now, had Israel kept Yamit in 1979, Hamas may have been in Gaza, but they could not have imported the weapons that they've all brought in through Egypt, and they would have been powerless to attack Israel and do all the things that they've done. So that example shows you how that territorial concession of just that town of Yamit has caused Israel 5 wars and countless casualties.
Well, that's an excellent answer to the question. It's a really sad situation for sure. It is well known that Israel ceded the whole of the Sinai Peninsula under the 1979 peace treaty with Egypt and Gaza, and most of Judea and Samaria to the Egyptian Authority under the 1994 Oslo agreements. What are other territorial concessions? And I'd like to ask specifically, what type of opposition did Israel have to doing this concession? Because it seems absurd.
You mean internal opposition?
Yeah.
Well, if we go back to the example of Yamit, there were very serious opposition where many supporters of Yamit who were not living there came, and the army forcibly removed them, and they were there was scenes of violence and terrible scenes, and no one was killed, but there was violent opposition because a lot of people in Israel understood that that was a fundamental mistake, and there has been a lot of opposition to these concessions all along. To come back to your earlier question, it's not as well known that Israel made other concessions beyond Sinai, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. So, for example, Israel made territorial concessions to Jordan in 1970, in 1975, and in 1994 in the Arava Valley. And that's the valley that separates Israel from Jordan. And these concessions total over 375 square kilometers, which is an area larger than Gaza. And not only that, they granted Jordan the right to draw an additional 50 million cubic meters of water from the Sea of Galilee. And Israel has a shortage of water. So there have been many, many concessions, and that's just one example.
What possible reason would they make concessions to Jordan, though?
Well, the slogan was land for peace, right? And so the idea was that you have to give land for them to give you peace.
So they give nothing, basically, and they get land.
Right. And as I said, there's no other historical example of the aggressor being returned to his original borders and certainly not gaining ground after his aggression has been defeated.
Now, under international law, when someone is attacked by another country and the attacking country loses, and doesn't the winner, the one that was attacked, get to keep the land?
I'm not a lawyer. I can't speak to international law, but I can tell you that as a student of history, that is what has happened in every single case going back to the beginning of human history.
And I believe under international law that's true, that you get to keep the land if you've won it in a defensive war. Not an aggressive war, but in a defensive war.
May well be so. You're a lawyer, so you know better than I.
That's what I'm saying as a lawyer. What about Lebanon? Did Israel recently cede territorial waters to Lebanon?
Yes. So the story is that Israel had for a dozen years been negotiating with Lebanon as to exactly where the water border should go. You know, the territorial waters extend out 12 miles for most countries, and the question is, where is that border between Israel
and... Is that because of the discovery of oil and gas?
It's connected. It's connected. I'll explain. So the Lebanese, yes, they wanted to move the border south so that this Kana oil field that had been discovered would be on their side. And Israel wanted it north of the Kana. And they argued over this for 12 years. And what happened is in each negotiation, the Israelis moved closer and closer to the Lebanese position, which is the Hezbollah position, because Hezbollah runs Lebanon.
There is no Lebanon, really, isn't it Hezbollah?
It's Hezbollah runs Lebanon. And ultimately, in 2022, they agreed to the original ultimate maximum Lebanese demand, which is called Line 23.
Why?
They wanted to, they said, deter Hezbollah from launching a war, and
God.
And that was 2 years ago, and we're now in a war with Hezbollah. So we see how effective that was.
What naivety! Unbelievable.
And meanwhile, we haven't changed that border. So not only did they move the border north of Kana, actually it splits Kana, but they gave them the prospecting rights to Kana, to the Kana oil field. The thinking was, if they have something to lose, then they will be at peace. And of course, that's also now proven completely false and hollow.
How can they not realize that Hamas and Hezbollah want Jews dead? That is the main purpose for their existence.
I'll tell you why. People always project onto other people their thinking. This is human nature. A thief always thinks someone's stealing from him, for example. So the Israelis are basically decent people. They basically want to just live their life. And their constant mistaken assumption is that the enemy is likewise. They are not fanatics, the Israelis, and they can't put themselves in the mindset of these fanatics who, for them, their religious fanaticism and ideology trumps anything about living well or economics or anything like that.
How about a future for their children?
No, because if you would strap bombs to your children to achieve your political ends, then obviously you're not too worried about the future of your children. So martyrdom is they elevate martyrdom to the highest virtue, and the Israelis can't understand because they're so far from that sort of thinking. An Israeli would never strap a bomb to his child for any reason, and then they therefore can't imagine that someone else would do that.
The Nazis wouldn't even do that.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, it takes basically a Islamic person to do that.
Well, in the Iran-Iraq war, the Iranians lined up children and marched them across their children. Right. Marched them across minefields to set off the mines. I don't think the Nazis ever did anything like that.
And I'll remind everybody that Iran and Iraq are both Islamic countries. One's Shia, one's Sunni, but they're all Islamic. And the value of human life just doesn't seem to exist in these countries.
Well, so to answer your question, the reason is that Israel is projecting her rational, modern, humanistic thinking onto the enemy and doesn't seem to be able to grasp the nature. Now, I think there's been a change in Israel on October the 7th, and I think people understand they're dealing with something very different than they thought they were. I see that with people I know, friends in Israel, people I talk to, and I see that with the government's attitude. They understood because of the horror of what Hamas did that it's as if you're dealing with the Nazis or worse, and you can't project onto them your thinking.
It's hard to believe they didn't know that before. But
yes, well, you and I have been talking about this for
over 20 years on this show.
I've been writing about it for, half a century practically, and no one's listening. But the good news is they are listening now.
Yes, finally. Devin, is Israel still considering future territorial concessions, or has the insanity of doing so finally left them?
What I can tell you, I'm not sure. I don't think they are since this war began. But just prior to the war, they were negotiating with Amos Hochstein, who's the same guy American envoy who negotiated the sea deal with Lebanon, for land concessions. Oh no, sorry, that was after the war, right? The Americans said you don't need to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon. We can get them to voluntarily go beyond the Litani River if you give them some land, right? And this land is not land that was ever Lebanese or in any way justifiable. Now, Hezbollah claims these little bits of land here and there, but their only reason they're claiming that is that Hezbollah claims to be a resistance movement, and they can't claim to be a resistance movement when they're not resisting any occupation. So they claim some little tiny piece of land, and they say they're resisting the Israeli occupation of that area, which has never been Lebanon. And so the Israelis were actually negotiating with Hochstein about these bits of land, and this is despite the fact that they're in the middle of a war with Lebanon. Now, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me, but it seems like the Hezbollah so far hasn't gone along with it anyway.
Okay, Devin, if they did give future territorial concessions, would Israel get anything in return? I mean, they don't seem to have ever gotten anything in return for territorial concessions.
Well, specifically in regard to this concession of little bits of land to Lebanon from the Galilee, Hezbollah would undertake, according to Hochstein, to remove its forces north of the Litani River. Now, first of all, it should be understood that their forces are illegal below the Litani River. There is UN Resolution 1701, in which they were supposed to never go south of the Litani from a previous war. So they're already in violation of that resolution by being there in the first place. In other words, they're selling you the same goods again. And they said, now we'll really go north of the Litani. But as I said, they're not agreeing to it. But even if they did, that's just a few miles. They could come back to the border from the Litani in a couple of hours. And they would either infiltrate back or just come back. And I think that if you gave these territorial concessions to Hezbollah, that is to Lebanon, they would see it as a victory because territory is the issue with them. And any territory you give them, however small, they're going to see as a victory for them and a defeat for you. And the same would be true in Gaza. If you came back to the October 6 borders in Gaza, they would see that as having fought the Israeli army to a standstill, and that would have been a victory, and they would be encouraged to do it again, as they've said they would do.
Okay, Devin, what do you suggest Israel do in regard to continuing demands for future territorial concessions? I mean, it's just to me, it's insanity. I mean, first of all, Lebanon doesn't really exist anymore, does it? Isn't it Hezbollah?
Yeah, it's a failed state. It's a terrorist-run state which has been hollowed out by Iran and its proxy Hezbollah. They've taken all the money out of the state. It's completely bankrupt. Only Hezbollah pays salaries to its people, and no one else has anything. The economy has completely collapsed. The banking system has collapsed. It's a true failed state.
It used to be called the Paris of the Orient or something.
Of the Middle East.
Of the Middle East.
Yes.
And it just seems like the world allows things like that to happen and is only critical of Israel whenever Israel's doing something. I mean, does the United Nations do anything regarding Hezbollah taking over Lebanon?
No, not only that. I don't know if you remember, but Lebanon accidentally blew up the entire port of Beirut. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It looked like an atomic bomb. They had stored so much weaponry there that they were importing from Iran, and some of it somehow caught fire. And it blew up the whole port of Beirut and a whole area of Beirut. And we don't know the numbers are killed, and nobody said anything about that.
Well, I mean, Iran always seems to have its hand in anything that's bad in the world. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe they don't get their hands into Africa or something. But, I mean, think about it. They killed U.S. Marines in Lebanon. They've blown up U.S. embassies. They supplied a lot of weapons to kill U.S. soldiers in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and they seem to get away with it all the time. I mean, it just, to me, it's amazing how they can do anything they want to destroy a country, and they just don't have to pay a price.
Well, that's because they understand the way the world really works, and Israel doesn't. They understand that the world works around power, and that if you have power, everyone will justify you, and if you don't, everyone will condemn you. And that's the way they operate, and it works for them.
Well, the United States certainly should have done something, in my opinion. after these terrorist events that Iran clearly performed. As I mentioned, the killing of the U.S. Marines, the blowing up of the American embassies, and they just get away with it all the time.
Well, we in the United States have been kicking the can down the road on Iran, just like Israel was kicking the can down on the road on Hamas. And just like today, Israel is paying a very heavy price for kicking the can down the road and not dealing with Hamas in the previous 4 wars that we've had with them. The United States will unfortunately pay a heavier price the more it puts off the inevitable confrontation with Iran, because they want to confront us. They are not holding any punches. They will do everything they can to harm us. So if we wait till after they get a nuclear weapon, for example, that's going to be much more complicated. And the stronger we allow them to become, the worse that's going to be for us.
Do you really think they don't already have an atomic weapon?
No, because they would have used it yesterday if they had
I
it.
think they have it, but they just don't have the delivery system yet. And I think that's what they're waiting for.
I think if they had it, they'd use it. They'd put it on a donkey cart and bring it into Israel. They don't need any fancy delivery system.
Well, then it's going to happen at some time in the future, in the not-too-distant future, from what you're saying.
Yes, unless someone does something about it, it will happen. They're dead set on it, and it will happen, yes.
So Israel is the main target, or maybe they're not. Maybe the United States is the main target, being the big Satan, the great Satan, and Israel is just the little Satan.
I would put it this way. America is the ultimate target. In other words, Israel's in the way because it's a local ally of the United States, but it's the United States that they want out of the Middle East. Their goal is to get the United States out of the Middle East.
And they're working toward it, aren't they?
Yes. Yes.
And is the United States resisting, or do you think it's going to be successful on Iran's part?
Certainly not resisting under the Biden administration, and it's not even clear whether Trump will resist it, because he has a sort of isolationist foreign policy today. So we don't know what will be.
What do you suggest Israel do with regard to continuing demands for further territorial concessions? As I mentioned before, you have a salami, you keep slicing pieces off. Eventually, there's no more salami.
Look, Israel's a very tiny country, and it's, I think, long past time she stopped giving away the little land and the few resources that she has. Only a loss of territory and not more territorial concessions by Israel is going to convince her enemies that their aggression against her doesn't pay. This is the only way to ensure that the unbelievable sacrifices that the Israeli people are making right now and the Israeli soldiers are making right now will not have been in vain, and that neither they nor their children will find themselves fighting again to retake the same territory from which they've been attacked so many times. We've been attacked now 5 times from Gaza, and we're fighting over the same territory. We've been attacked 3 times from Lebanon. I'm only referring to recent times, not 1948, 1967. I'm only talking in recent times. And each time we go back to square one. So we need to change the paradigm, and we need to move the border so that they know that they pay a price for their aggression. If Israel is going to have a decisive victory, like Prime Minister Netanyahu says we are, and if you want lasting peace, then Israel has to change its approach and stop giving away territory.
Okay, Secretary of State Blinken has repeatedly said that Israel must not permanently annex territory from Gaza. That to me seems insanity, but will Israel comply? Why or why not?
No, they will not, because they've learned their lesson. I believe that the situation after October 7th is never going to go back to the situation prior to October 6th. Israel, as you said, is paying the price for mistakes going back many years. The good news is they understand now their mistakes, finally, belatedly, at long last. Now, one step in the right direction that shows the correct way is that Israel is now creating a buffer zone within Gaza. And this is, by the way, what Blinken was referring to in not taking territory with Gaza. They're creating a buffer of 1 kilometer or 2 on all of Gaza's borders with Israel and with Egypt. And what that will allow is for the 250,000 displaced people from the area around Gaza and from the north around Lebanon to go back to their homes, because they can't possibly go back to their homes, which are wrecked and ruined, from October 7th when you have Hamas across the border threatening to do the same thing over and over again. No one's going to invest and go to live there and allow their children to walk the streets and go to school there when that's hanging over their head. So they need the buffer for that reason. But there's an also equally important reason they need that buffer, and that is to make Gaza and Hamas pay a price for their aggression. And then they will understand that they've been defeated. In every one of the past 4 wars with Gaza, we've beaten them, we've destroyed a lot, we've killed a lot of them, and they come out with their hands in a V for victory sign out of the rubble and say we won. If you take territory from them, that's not going to be the picture you see. Contrary to what Secretary of State Blinken is saying, Israel must take territory from Gaza, not cede territory, and it's imperative that she does that. And I would say that you could apply a similar policy to Lebanon. In other words, you can push Hezbollah back to the Litani River, and that's what they plan to do. Israel wants to fight this war one front at a time, but they do plan to and openly say that they're going, when they're done with Gaza, they're going into Lebanon and they're going to push Hezbollah back, because the same thing, no one will live along the border if you don't do that. And I would say you can apply the same thing to Judea and Samaria. There is, for example, Jenin, where terrorists come across every day. There's been attacks every day for the last 2 years, and you could go back 50 years. And there's no reason for us to go in and out of Jenin and kill some of them, and they come back and kill some of us. You drop leaflets on Jenin like we did on Gaza City. You tell the civilians to leave. You go in and destroy the terrorists. You annex Jenin to Israel. You've now lost Jenin because you've used it as a springboard to attack Israel. And if they come from another town, you lose that town. And eventually that can create deterrence. Nothing short of that will create deterrence.
Why does Israel supply water, food, fuel, etc., concrete to the enemies, knowing that they're going to create terrorist tunnels and so on, have the light to do so by the electricity supplied by Israel and so on? It drives me crazy to know that Israel is complicit in this terrorism. Before I get to the question, let's take a call from Jock in Scottsdale. Jock, you're on the air.
Yeah, quick question. Can Netanyahu hold off on a ceasefire until the election in November? And if Trump wins, will that strengthen Israel's position in fighting?
Okay, that's a good question. Both of your questions, Jock, are good questions. So first of all, he could not hold off a ceasefire until November if a ceasefire was offered that was palatable to Israel. So far, Hamas is not agreeing to anything reasonable. Netanyahu's called their demands delusional, so we don't have to worry about it. But because of the hostages and internal pressure on Israel to free the hostages, he could not reject a ceasefire if reasonable terms were demanded in exchange for hostages. I don't mean a permanent ceasefire. I mean a temporary ceasefire. They already did do one ceasefire. They got 100 hostages back. And if they had a chance to get more, they would do it. I'm not saying I agree with that or not. I'm saying that's what would happen. As for Trump, I was a big supporter of Trump, but he has said things since his loss in the previous election that indicate he's going to take a very isolationist foreign policy this time. He has not. He generally says things that he's done things for Israel, but he never talks about what he would do in the future. I haven't seen one statement from him on the Gaza war, and that would be an excellent opportunity for him to criticize Biden on that issue, and he never says it. So I honestly don't know what Trump might do. It's a crapshoot. We don't know.
Okay, thanks for your call, Jock. Devin, let's go back to that question I asked before the last break. Why does Israel supply food, electric, water, concrete, the materials certainly for the terror tunnels to the sworn enemies of Israel that would like to destroy Israel if they could?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't know of any country in the history of war, in the history of the world, which has ever supplied food, concrete, electricity, oil to its enemy during a time of war, except for Israel. I don't think we supplied the Japanese with food and oil, and I don't think, in fact, our tactic was to cut them off from oil. We certainly didn't supply the Germans with food and oil. I'm talking about until they surrender. But when they're at war with you, we would not supply them with anything. During World War I, our policy was to starve the Germans into submission. And that's generally, I've never seen anything like it. So first of all, the hypocrisy of the world in demanding that Israel supply her enemy with whom she's at war, who viciously attacked her on October 7th, and supply her with what she needs to carry out the war, makes no sense to me at all.
It's called insanity, Devin. Insanity.
It makes no sense. But why are they doing it? Because they're under pressure from the Biden administration to do it. And the Israelis believe, again, I won't say rightly or wrongly, but the Israeli government believes that it's in their interest. Because if we see scenes of people in Gaza starving, suffering, that helps Hamas. And they therefore think that it's in their interest to supply this kind of humanitarian assistance. Now, why supply oil, which they need to run the tunnels? In other words, without oil, they would have to come out of the tunnels. The war would have been over a long time ago. Many Israeli soldiers are dying because they're still fighting in the tunnels. This makes no sense to me at all. I can't understand it. There are, in fact, protests on the Israeli border with Gaza at Keren Shalom, the crossing that goes from Israel to Gaza.
Who's protesting?
Israelis who are protesting, some of them families of the hostages, and they're stopping the trucks of aid from getting in at least through that opening. They can get in through Egypt, but these people are saying just what you're saying. We don't want to be supplying the enemy with these goods as long as they hold hostages. I would say at a minimum, Israel should be demanding their hostages in exchange for these things. You're holding your hostages and you're supplying them. This makes no sense to me. I'm sorry.
Okay, another caller, Richard from Scottsdale. Go ahead, Richard. Richard, what's your question?
Okay, my question is, a lot of people have been killed in Gaza. How does Israel deal with that situation?
What do you mean? Which people are you talking about?
Palestinians. You know, Israel is in Gaza, and they've killed lots of people, either purposely or not purposely. But a lot of Gaza people have been killed. How do the Israelis deal with the fact that that so many of these people to the south have been killed, have been murdered, or whatever?
Well, it's certainly not murdered, but go ahead, Devin.
Thank you for your question, Richard. Let me ask yourself, Richard, when we fought World War II and we blanket bombed Germany and killed 5 million Germans, were they all German Nazis or were some of them civilians? When we dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and we killed 2 million Japanese, we killed 100,000 Japanese in one night in the Tokyo firebombing, and which is 4 times the number that's been killed in Gaza till now. And we killed 6 times the number that's been killed in Gaza in one night in bombing Hiroshima. And this is, and I could go on in Afghanistan and Iraq and all the other wars the United States fought. And it's not only the United States, it's other countries. Now, unlike Israel, which tries not to kill civilians, but they get killed because Hamas is hiding behind civilians. We know that they put all their infrastructure under civilian infrastructure, especially hospitals, especially schools. Unlike Israel, which tries to avoid killing civilians, the United States blanket bombed German cities with the policy was to kill civilians, to dehouse German workers so we would shorten the war. That was the policy of dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima. And that's been not only the United States' policy, but the policy of every country in the world and every war. So it's sheer anti-Semitic double standard to say that Israel is supposed to fight a war in which there are no civilian casualties on the other side, a war that she did not seek and did not start. And Israel will fight a war in the same way that everyone else will fight the war. And in fact, she's being much more humane than we are in the United States in our wars. So I can't understand this hypocritical criticism where we have killed millions of civilians and Israel is condemned when civilians are killed in collateral damage, which she tries to avoid.
Okay, thanks for that question, Richard. Devin, apparently there's more than 1 million people still in Gaza. What is Israel supposed to do with the million people, and is it Israel's responsibility in the first place?
There's over 2 million people in Gaza. According to the Geneva Conventions, a country is not responsible for the welfare of a civilian population as long as they are at war with you. You become responsible for them only when they surrender. So when Japan surrendered to the United States, we became responsible for the welfare of the Japanese people, but not before that. Israel is not responsible for the people of Gaza as long as they are at war with Israel. And make no mistake, this nonsense about the innocent people of Gaza, they are Hamas and Hamas is them. They elected Hamas. Hamas is their brothers, their uncles, and their sons. They support Hamas. When the Hamas fighters came in on October 6th and started massacring people, they called everyone from the mosques to follow them. Thousands of Gazan, innocent people of Gaza, came across the border and participated in the rape, murder, looting that was going on in Israel for 3 days. So we're not buying the innocent people of Gaza argument. They're no more innocent than the Germans were innocent in World War II. They elected the Nazis, and the people of Gaza elected Hamas.
We have 1 minute to go. I was going to ask Devin why there is so much anti-Israel activity in the U.S. government and on U.S. campuses, but I can give you 30 seconds, Devin. Go ahead.
All right, very quickly. President Biden is not anti-Israel. He's from the old school Democrats who actually are sympathetic to Israel emotionally, but he's surrounded by former Obama administration people like Malley and Susan Rice and Ben Rhodes, who are extremely anti-Israel, and they are trying to pursue the same policies they pursued under the Obama administration. On the campuses, many of these people are not American citizens. They are foreign students, local Muslims, and I don't think they represent average Americans.
Devin Spear, thank you very much. Great presentation. I look forward to being on the show again. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.